Welcome to Post Pod Study, where we don't just waste time listening to podcasts, we waste time reviewing them. I'm Mitty, and today we're picking apart a podcast where two lifelong friends talk about life for a long time. That's right, Good Mythical Morning does have a podcast, but it definitely feels like that's selling it short. This isn't just an extension of a wacky internet variety show. Ear Biscuits will many times over during the run of its course consider purpose, family, business, friendship, religion, death, and much, much more. But not only does it consider these things, it questions the circumstances that are created from their intersection. So let's deconstruct exactly how Rhett and Link, some of the biggest titans of YouTube, go about exploring themselves and the world around them. Just for some context, Rhett and Link were born and raised in North Carolina and met in early grade school. They've been friends for more than 30 years. They went to church together and started out their career in skits, then moved their way up to hosting. Over the course of their career, they've created one of the biggest media brands on YouTube. The description Spotify gives us about the podcast is, join Rhett and Link, hosts of the popular daily YouTube show, Good Mythical Morning, and authors of the New York Times bestseller, Book of Mythicality, in a candid weekly conversation for your entertainment. Now, I don't know if it's saucy enough to grab attention, but despite the fact that they try hard not to be beholden to Good Mythical Morning, they still need it for recognition. Good Mythical Morning is hardly the most defining factor of this podcast, though. They try giving us the aspects of themselves beyond the show. A glimpse of their expansive list of side projects, which are a recurring staple of the podcast. They will consider the nuts and bolts of projects. The most vital part of the whole format by far, though, is that this is two fathers, business owners, partners, best friends, and YouTubers having a real conversation about anything and everything they can set their minds to. Podcasts are often scary. The idea of committing up to 1,000 hours for somebody to talk to you and a 1 in 10 chance of being entertained is rough sometimes. People will tell you these don't even get good until you get 20 hours in. These 5 are what I consider to be your best swing at getting into it. Oh boy, what a place to start. This episode makes you feel like you're sitting in on a conversation conducted on 2 leather lounging chairs. Like sitcom dads are discussing the ins and outs of their adventure that you can see in theaters near you. Don't let the name of this one fool you, though. We get plenty of perspective, experience, and conversation from either side here. Link talks about his repeated learnings over the course of renting an RV for a family trip to the Grand Canyon. Rhett talks about his horseback riding excursion where he got to meet a couple of rare characters and embody the Old West. The vision we get of the competence and confidence, sometimes lack thereof even, is a piece that I suppose doesn't stop at their online scripted characters, but apparently defines their everyday lives, and it's entertaining. They both seeked and enjoyed different things from their vacations. The way they tended to enjoy their time and the way they can talk about refined individual experiences contributed to the flavor and variance it takes for them to stay an entertaining and dynamic team. A last little piece that makes this episode that much more relevant is that in later episodes, they start to split vacation episodes like this in order to have one for Rhett and one for Link. I strongly feel that this was one of the episodes that made them move to splitting their vacation episodes into 2. This was well performing, and they had to go over time, and both of them had a bounty of little things to talk about. The thing that makes this episode a worthwhile place to look at the series from is that it really displays the deep dives they tend to take into their personal flaws and the willingness they have to change them. On both of the major subjects of this episode, we see Rhett and Link identify a problem that stems from their own personality type. They consider the implications these problems carry for others. When they talk about the frequency that they interrupt people, they describe how this has an effect on their on-screen chemistry, as well as how it could be detrimental from a management perspective for their business. On the other side of the coin, we hear the extent an argument can go just off of the simple premise of which side of the bed you lay on. Rhett informs us of a quarrel between him and his wife over how appropriate his reasoning is for sleeping on a certain side of the bed. He tells us about the concession that he made, not for himself, but just because he understood his wife's concern and annoyance about his hang-up. This episode also washes us with the context of the spikier side of each of their styles of interaction, and how human their tendencies are for agreeableness and confrontation. It's pretty easy to say that these are some of the most raw episodes of Ear Biscuits ever. We receive hints throughout this little journey they take us on at how truly close these two are. I might even venture the closest people to each other, despite having wives they've been married to for 20 plus years. This connection is forged mostly by their background, which is deeply rooted in religion. They talk about their time in Bible studies, their religious families, their work as missionaries. These episodes are no small admission. They're discussing their rejection of the caste that not only created them, but held them together their whole life. In Rhett's parts, we hear the engaging tale of a man who discovered science and was forced to upend his worldview because of the undeniable way the evidence shifted. We get yet another famously sharp contrast from the pair as we hear Link's story, someone who placed their community and their expectations of themselves above all else, and was only able to loosen his grasp on this when he realized that these expectations weren't going to make him happy. This is such a deep cut because this was them bearing their new world order to their listeners. Before they started down this road, their households were Christian. Their wives were in just as involved places in the church as they were. Some of their farthest reaching friends besides each other were still religious, and you better believe their community back in their hometown in North Carolina would put a whole new label on them based on this. I think this episode marked the beginning of an era as they flipped the internet's beliefs about them and their branding completely. This episode reels us in with some nostalgia for the older listeners, framing some of the rich history of Rhett and Link. They tell us about the past of one of the tables they're sitting at that followed them through the bulk of Ear Biscuits after they established that they couldn't record this episode together. Just by the title, you can tell how much this episode stresses family expectations and the difficulties that accompany said expectations. The story sort of picks apart the struggles that parents have gone through in order to create experiences for their kids, and the defiance that kids have for these experiences. I'd like to press into some of the troubles of experiencing and understanding people in their fullness. In this episode, we get a slightly more expanded picture of Rhett and Link, widened by their own children. The picture they give us is rather tame, however. The first question asks their children the weirdest thing they do at home, and on top of some of their children not even answering, some of the answers are rather bland, from staying on the toilet too much to reusing things. What I'd like to point out most is the discrepancy between the picture Rhett and Link paint of each other versus the ones their family paints of them versus the ones they've painted for themselves as entertainers. These are all different shades and persuasions of the same person, with very different ideas of how loud and quirky and even unique these people are. Some of this would be wholly intentional based on the fact that they run a business relying on their public image. Beyond that, we must remember that no image of any person can be completed with as little as their online appearance, nor can we find the sum of their character through their friends' eyes, or surprisingly even their families. Speaking of the lines blurred between reality and entertainment, Rhett and Link have a massive mythology that's packed to the gills with their history, friendships, family ties, and employee interactions. But this mythology is entirely built on their origin story. How did some of the biggest YouTubers known to the platform become some of the best friends known to the world? They've said it many times in interviews. On the first day of first grade, they were held in from recess for writing bad words on their desk. Their teachers made them color pictures of mythical beasts. This is the foundation for everything they are and everything they have today. I've already alluded to the veil that exists for fans that separates their real story and the one they craft as a business to brand themselves. And this episode of Ear Biscuits is what I want everyone to think of when they think about the reality of celebrities. They do talk about the nature of memory and how it's ever-changing, but I don't believe that's where we stop questioning the fabrication. They said themselves this is the interview opener. This is the seamless entrance into their world. They start out debunking their own tapestry by saying outright, there's no way they wrote bad words on the desk at the time. They also say that they aren't exactly sure they were drawing mythical creatures. Most glaringly, though, their teacher from the time testified that she would never keep a kitten from recess. They let us know more likely than not this is probably the merging of 3 separate stories. Throughout the following section, they discuss the complexity of getting financial support from people through an unfiltered, unchanged story. They need to pitch people on something fun, energetic, and easy to convey. And throughout all of their career, not just the start of their friendship, they've tweaked things to make telling the story easier. It's actually pretty intriguing how much of my dislikes have clear representation in my must-listen list. I think their heavy interaction and honesty about the need to monetize and maintain a brand is refreshing. You don't often get celebrities, influencers, or entertainers that are this upfront about where you fit into them making money. I talked about how they later split episodes for vacations. They think there's enough content there, they can get 2 weeks of recordings instead of 1. And this is so bad for the quality of the episodes to me. The reason why Link's RV trip fail popped off is because they had a very constant stream of things to talk about, back and forth, so they could add, comment, or tone in with their own perspective. When you take out their parts in each other's stories, you end up with so many more yups and mm-hms. There really is a limit to how far you can go with one person holding the floor for an extended amount of time. This only worked with their spiritual deconstruction videos because they had so much to talk about at first. They didn't work well past the initial set. Every continuation for spiritual deconstruction felt empty. This sort of emptiness is basically the biggest problem, even outside of the multi-part episodes. We see them scraping the bottom for substantive material. 2 people can be a very difficult amount of people in terms of sustaining weekly, repeated conversations free of redundancy. It really does show through sometimes. Their best avenue is one of them nodding along to the other, not saying much at all. Now that I've talked about some of the musts in the series and glossed over what I consider to be some of the flaws, overall, there isn't much to complain about. Rhett and Link are very charismatic and well composed. They regularly pull a full-form conversation out of the most off-the-wall passing thought. If you enjoy Good Mythical Morning, or even some of the pair's quirkier ventures, then Ear Biscuits is a slam dunk. But don't sleep on it just because you don't know them. If 2 best friends talking about the weirdest variety of things you might ever find, from absolutely nothing to absolutely everything, sounds like fun to listen to, get into Ear Biscuits. It's 4 out of 5 mics for me. Now I need to know what you think about the internet dads, though. Was I too harsh? Or too soft? Are there any episodes I really should have talked about? What's your favorite part about the podcast? If you need to get a friend into the podcast, send this to them. Like and subscribe so you can see what other podcasts I have thoughts on.